The chamber was already silent when I walked in. Not the polite silence of a meeting about to begin, but the cold, heavy silence of a verdict already decided. 11 alien representatives sat in a half-circle behind a curved obsidian table, and every single one of them was looking at me the way you look at something small that has wandered somewhere it should not be. I did not slow my steps. I did not look at the floor. I was Commander Ambassador Lena Graves, the only human being in a room that smelled like 3 different atmospheres filtered together, and I had exactly one job. Do not let them see that we had nothing. The Kethsorn ambassador spoke first. His name, translated into something my tongue could manage, was Counselor Drev. He had 4 arms, skin the color of old iron, and the kind of patience that only comes from living 400 years. He slid a crystalline document across the table toward me without ceremony or warmth. "The compact of subordination," he said, his translator rendering his voice as something between a cello and the sound a mountain makes when it shifts. "Humanity will sign it today. The Council has voted." I picked it up. I read it slowly, even though I had already read every version of this document that our intelligence team had intercepted over the past 6 months. The terms had not changed. Humanity would cap our faster-than-light expansion at our current 12 settled systems. Our military fleet would be reduced to a ceremonial size. Every artificial intelligence project our species was running would be submitted to Council review within 90 days. Every research initiative above a certain energy threshold would require prior approval from a Council-appointed oversight body. All colonial development plans would need to be filed with the Orendai Administrative Office at least 2 standard years before any work began. It was not a treaty. It was a leash. A very well-worded, formally presented, procedurally ironclad leash. I set the document down carefully, as if it were made of something fragile. "I will need time to review this with my government," I said. "You have reviewed it," said the Vale representative. She had no name that translated cleanly. Her people communicated in layered frequencies that our best linguists had been trying to decode for a decade. The voice that came through the translator was flat, precise, and very old. "Your government has reviewed it. This meeting is not for review. It is for signatures." Procedural translation protocols require that any binding document be formally certified through a delegate's home government within a minimum of 72 standard hours, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I cite the Orendal Convention, Article 14, subsection 9. There was a pause, a long one. I watched Drev's 4 hands go very still, which was how Kethsorn expressed irritation. Across the table, the Orendai ambassador shifted his weight. He was broad, with a posture that conveyed the ease of something that has never lost a negotiation. The Orendai had been navigating these political currents for 200,000 years. His expression was not hostile. It was mildly inconvenienced, which was somehow worse. "You are stalling," Drev said. "I am following protocol," I replied, "which is, as I understand it, one of the things the Council values." The Vale representative made a sound that did not go through the translator at all. I took that as either deep disapproval or the closest thing she had to a laugh. With the Vale, after 3 years, I still could not always tell the difference. I got my 72 hours. I used every single one of them with the particular focused desperation of someone who has no real cards, but intends to keep the game going anyway. I filed 11 procedural requests before the first day was done. I requested new translations of 4 clauses that were, I claimed, ambiguous in the human linguistic framework. I asked for a formal clarification on the definition of ceremonial military tonnage as it applied to vessels equipped for deep space exploration. I submitted a petition to have a human legal observer present for the certification process, and when that was denied, I submitted a counterpetition asking why it was denied, and requesting that the denial be formally documented in the session record. I then requested access to the session record to confirm the documentation had been correctly added. I asked for a 3-hour recess to consult with my communications team. I requested the recess again when the first one was denied. I filed a formal objection to the denial of the recess on the grounds that the Orindal Convention guaranteed delegates access to communications technology during any certification proceedings. The Council's procedural secretary, a Keth-sworn official named Assistant Clerk Reth, stopped responding to my requests personally after the fourth one. I sent them anyway. The record would show they had been sent. Back in my private quarters aboard the station, I was running on 4 hours of sleep over 3 days, and my communications officer, a young man named Peter Oakes who had been working alongside me for 2 years, and had the remarkable gift of appearing calm when everything was rapidly deteriorating, handed me a decoded message from Earth Command. I read it twice. Then I sat down. The message was 12 words. We have no viable response to enforcement. Buy more time. We are working. That was it. No strategy outlined in careful military language. No reassurance about fleets being repositioned or alliances being quietly formed behind the scenes. No list of options being considered. Just 11 words and the quiet, terrifying weight of what was not being said. We were not working toward a specific thing. We were working to buy time for working. I wrote back 4 words, how much more time? The response came 6 hours later. It was 1 word, more. I put the message down and looked at the ceiling of my quarters for a long time. The ceiling of the confluence was a neutral gray-white, designed to be inoffensive to the maximum number of species. It was perfectly featureless. It gave me nothing. I went back to the chamber on the 3rd day and sat across from 11 civilizations that had been navigating the stars before my species had invented writing. The Orindai ambassador watched me with that particular stillness of his. The Keth-sworn representative sat with forearmed symmetry that I found faintly unsettling even after years of exposure to it. The Veil representative had her layered eyes on me with an attention that felt like being read. Ambassador Graves, Drev said, your procedural requests have been noted, reviewed, and denied, each one in full accordance with the Orindal Convention which you yourself cited. We have satisfied every technical obligation this body is required to satisfy. It is time. I have one additional request, I said. Denied, he said, before I had said what it was. I looked at him. I would like that denial formally entered into the record, I said. A pause, a very measured pause. Entered, he said. I looked around the table, 11 civilizations watching me. The certainty in the room was a physical thing. They were certain I had run out of maneuvers. They were certain that something as young and small and unproven as humanity could not possibly have anything left. I thought about what Peter had said to me the night before, when I had finally told him the full truth. He had been quiet for almost a full minute. Then he said, well, if we are going to go down, at least go down loud. Peter was 26 years old. Occasionally, he said things that cut through every complication I had built around a problem and left just the essential shape of it. I placed both hands flat on the table. Humanity declines to sign the Compact of Subordination, I said. The room was already quiet, but it went a different kind of quiet. And I want to be very clear about something, so that this council understands what that means. If enforcement is attempted by any member species, individually or collectively, humanity will ensure that the cost of that enforcement exceeds any calculation your current models are capable of producing. The silence that followed had weight. Drev leaned forward. That is a threat. It is a statement of consequence, I said. I suggest you treat those two things as different. The Veil representative spoke. Her translator delay was longer than usual. Ambassador, we are 11 civilizations with a combined fleet presence that your species could not measure without developing new mathematics. What exactly are you suggesting humanity could do? I let the pause stretch just long enough. I suppose, I said quietly, you will find out if you proceed with enforcement. Then I stood up, collected the unsigned compact, and walked out of the chamber. Behind me, clear through my earpiece translation feed, I heard Drev's voice, calm and certain. The humans are bluffing. 11 votes, all in favor, the compact would be enforced. I walked all the way back to my quarters, closed the door, and stood in the middle of the room for a very long time. Drev was right. I had nothing. I had a bluff built from confidence and rehearsed calm, and 2 years of learning how to appear more certain than I was. And I had just aimed it at the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, while Earth Command sent me one-word messages from very far away. I sent a message to Earth. It was 5 words: whatever you are working on, work faster. I sat at my desk and looked through the viewport at the stars, the same stars that species far older than mine had named and cataloged and built their histories around. I thought about what it meant to be the newest thing at a table of ancients. I thought about how we had built fires when we were cold and boats when the water rose and rockets when gravity was the last barrier we had not yet cleared. And I thought, we have done something like this before, not this exactly, but something like this. Something where the only available option was to keep moving and trust that the ground would appear beneath your feet. I held on to that. In the dark with the stars watching, I held on to that and did not let it go. The enforcement drones arrived at the edge of the Kepler system 3 weeks after the vote. They were Orandai design, wide flat hexagonal platforms drifting at the boundary of our outermost settled system like quiet warnings. They did not fire. They did not broadcast hostile signals. They were simply present, the way a locked door is present, telling you without any words that something fundamental has changed, and the change is not in your favor. I was not in the Kepler system when they arrived. I was on Earth for the first time in 8 months, having been transported back through a series of formal protocols that the Council had allowed, because removing me from the station, while enforcement began suited them. It kept the principal human voice off the floor while the drones moved into position. It was a neat piece of procedural maneuvering, and I had to acknowledge privately that it was well done. Earth looked the same as it always looked when I returned from long distances, large and green and full of weather, and the particular beautiful chaos of a planet that was still very much alive and had no interest in waiting for you while you were away. I did not stop to appreciate it. I was met at the transport pad by 2 people in civilian clothes who put me in a vehicle without explaining our destination, and we drove for 4 hours into country that became progressively colder and more empty until the vehicle stopped at a gate in a fence that had no signs on it at all. The facility on the other side of that gate had no name on any official government document I had ever seen. The people who worked there held job titles that described positions in other departments, jobs they technically still maintained on paper, budgets filed under headings like atmospheric modeling research and theoretical propulsion dynamics, and in one case that I later learned about and found genuinely funny, experimental meteorology. The mountain that housed it was cold, and the corridors inside it were lit with pale, even light, the light of places that have never had any reason to think about the sun. A man named Dr. Colin Farr met me at the 4th security checkpoint. He was 53, lean and unhurried, with a face that had clearly been young once and had become entirely comfortable with no longer being so. He carried a tablet in one hand and a paper notebook in the other, which struck me as an unusual combination for someone working in a facility that did not officially exist. He extended his free hand and shook mine with the firm grip of someone who had spent years working with his hands before he started working primarily with his mind. "Ambassador Graves," he said, "thank you for coming quickly." "I was told it was important," I said. "That is one word for it," he said, and led me into the mountain. What followed was 4 hours that I have thought about almost every day since, not because the science was beyond me, though it frequently was, not because of the size of what was shown to me, though that was extraordinary enough. What I keep thinking about is the quality of the people in that place, their ordinariness, the way they move between workstations with the focused ease of people who care deeply about a problem and have been caring about it for long enough that the caring has become comfortable. They looked like teachers. They looked like people who stay late not because someone told them to, but because the question is still open, and open questions will not let you rest. Collins sat me down at a conference table and put 2 tablets in front of me and did not apologize for how long this was going to take. He started at the beginning, which was further back than I expected. "We have taught for a long time that stars are passive objects," he said. "Enormous nuclear furnaces, yes, but isolated, self-contained, operating independently of their neighbors. This was a useful simplification. It was not entirely accurate." He pulled up a diagram. It meant nothing to me immediately and almost everything to me by the end of the session. Every star in the galaxy is participating in a larger thermodynamic network. The gravitational relationships, the magnetic field interactions, the radiation pressure exchange cycles, the resonance patterns between stellar objects within certain distances. These are all part of a system, a very old system, one that has been running continuously for approximately 13 billion years. "How old is the team that figured that out?" I asked. "Our average age is 38, he said. "Our youngest full researcher is 29. I let that sit for a moment. "Long enough that the system has become very stable and very predictable," he continued. "And predictable systems have leverage points, places where a precise input produces an effect far larger than the input itself would suggest. We discovered ours during a study of binary star magnetic field interactions. It was not what we were looking for. In fact, it was a result we spent 8 months trying to explain away, because it was so far outside what our models predicted that our first assumption was that we had made an error somewhere." "But you had not," I said. "We had not. What we had found was that there exist precise configurations of energy input applied to specific coordinates within the thermodynamic chain that can initiate a cascade effect. Not violent, nothing explosive, something much quieter and much more permanent." He described the cascade in terms I could follow if I concentrated fully and did not try to think about anything else at the same time. The nuclear fusion process at the core of a star relies on pressure, heat, and a precise balance of forces that have maintained equilibrium for millions or billions of years. The cascade does not attack that process directly. It introduces a disruption at a point in the thermodynamic network that is connected to that equilibrium in ways that had not been understood before his team did this work. The disruption propagates through the network. The equilibrium shifts. The fusion process, deprived of the conditions it requires, stops. "Stops," I said. "Completely. The star continues to exist as a physical mass. There is no explosion. There is no collapse into any kind of dense remnant. The mass remains essentially as it was, but the nuclear processes cease. The radiation ceases. The light ceases. The heat ceases." He paused. "The star becomes, for all practical purposes, a very large, very cold, completely dark object." "You tested this," I said. "Once," he said, 14 months ago, a red dwarf star 31 light-years from the nearest inhabited system, no planets with life, no habitation of any kind, chosen with a great deal of care over the course of 7 months of site selection work. And it went dark in 6 hours and 14 minutes, he said. It has not shown any sign of resuming activity in the 14 months since. We do not believe it will." I stood up slowly and walked to the window that looked out onto the main research level below, where those ordinary-looking people were moving between their workstations with their quiet, focused energy. A young woman at the nearest station was making notes in a physical notebook. A man 2 stations over was eating a sandwich while reading something on 2 screens at once. None of them looked up. None of them seemed aware that anything unusual was happening above them. "How large is the device required to do this?" I asked. "At current miniaturization levels, it fits in a standard cargo container." "Delivery." "Any conventional launch vehicle. The targeting algorithm manages the rest once within operational range." I thought about the Orendai enforcement drones sitting at the edge of the Kepler system, flat and hexagonal and patient, and the Kethsorn laugh that sounded like gravel in a drain, and 12 words from Earth Command. "Dr. Farr," I said, still looking at the research floor below, How did this not trigger any monitoring alert? 11 years of work, 41 people, a test on an actual star. The Council's surveillance systems have been tracking our scientific output since first contact. How did none of it get flagged? He smiled. It was a small, private smile, the kind that belongs to someone who has spent years enjoying a joke that only they fully understand. We published it, he said. I turned around. We published every significant finding, every theoretical breakthrough, every relevant mathematical development. It appeared in peer-reviewed physics journals, conference proceedings. One of our senior researchers presented the core thermodynamic concepts at an international symposium 6 years ago in front of 400 people. It was very well received. Several papers citing it were published in the following year. I stared at him for a long moment. The Council's monitoring algorithms, he continued, are configured to identify research with obvious military applications, high-energy propulsion, materials with weapons-grade properties, biological research above certain thresholds. They are very good at identifying those things. Stellar thermodynamics as an abstract theoretical discipline was classified by their system as low-threat academic work, the kind of physics that has no immediate application, the kind of mathematics that exists for its own sake. He paused. We did not plan that. We simply work in the open. We share what we find. That is how science is supposed to function. It happened that what we were finding looked, from the outside, exactly like mathematics. The room was quiet. Outside the window, a researcher finished her notes and moved to the next workstation with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who has been at this long enough to know when to push and when to wait. We were not trying to outmaneuver anyone, he said. We were following a question, and the question led us somewhere that none of us had planned. I looked at the whiteboard behind him. It was covered in equations layered over other equations, some partially erased and rewritten, the physical record of 11 years of people caring about a problem and refusing to stop. You are telling me, I said slowly, that the bluff was never a bluff. The bluff was always real, Colin said quietly. You simply did not know it yet. I flew back to my quarters that night and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the weight of what I was now carrying. 2 human freighters had been impounded at an Orendaiway station the previous day. A third was being held at a Kethsorn border checkpoint. More enforcement platforms were being positioned. The enforcement was quiet and methodical and confident, the confidence of something that has no reason to doubt the outcome. I thought about 41 people in a mountain following a question for 11 years, sharing everything they found, not trying to hide anything, not even realizing that what they were building could be called something other than physics. I thought about what it said about us, that our instinct is to share, that we publish what we discover, that the knowledge circulates because we cannot imagine why it would not. And I thought, that instinct is exactly what made this possible. I requested transport back to Confluence the next morning. There was a meeting to attend, and this time, I knew what I was carrying when I walked through the door. The transport docked at Confluence at 600 station time. The council session was scheduled for 1000. I used the 4 hours carefully. I ate a full meal for the first time in 3 days. I changed into my formal uniform. I sat at the small desk in my quarters with a cup of coffee that I drank slowly, thinking through exactly what I was going to say and what I was not going to say and why. Peter Oakes found me with 40 minutes remaining, when I was already dressed and had been sitting with my hands flat on the desk for approximately 20 minutes, which he identified immediately as a sign that I was thinking through something I could not resolve by thinking alone. "How are you?" he asked, sitting across from me without invitation, which was something I had always liked about him. "Ready," I said. "That is not what I asked." I looked at him. "I am feeling the weight of what happens if I get this wrong," I said honestly. "What happens if you get it right?" he asked. "Then I have to figure out what right means in a situation where the right answer, still, involves doing something that cannot be undone." He thought about that genuinely, turning it over. Stars have been going dark on their own for 13 billion years, he said. We are just doing it faster. That is not actually comforting, Peter. It was not meant to be comforting. It was meant to give you a sense of scale. He stood up. You have never been wrong about the things that matter. I have worked with you for 2 years. You get the important things right. Trust that. He left before I could answer. I walked into the council chamber at exactly 1000. Drev called the session to order without preamble. No opening remarks. The council had decided formality was no longer necessary. Ambassador Graves, humanity remains in breach of the Compact of Subordination. 3 human vessels are under council authority. Additional enforcement platforms have been deployed to the Kepler border. This session is a final opportunity for voluntary compliance before more significant measures are implemented. I stood up. I have a statement, I said. You may deliver it briefly, Drev said. I will deliver it accurately, I replied, and before he could respond, I placed a data chip on the table and slid it toward the center with a steady hand. What is on that chip is an incomplete version of the research documentation for a project called Stilpon. Incomplete because the complete documentation would take approximately 11 hours to read. What is there is enough to understand the essential facts. The Orendai ambassador picked up the chip. What this represents, I continued, is a technology developed by human scientists over 11 years, published openly in peer-reviewed academic journals, which enables the precise interruption of stellar nuclear fusion. The affected star does not explode. It does not collapse. It simply ceases to function as a star, permanently. Not a sound in the chamber. We have tested it once, I said. A red dwarf star, 31 light-years from the nearest inhabited system. In 6 hours and 14 minutes it went dark. In 14 months since that test, it has shown no sign of resuming activity. Still nothing. 11 civilizations completely still. I am not here to threaten this council, I said. I am here because I believe that honesty, even when uncomfortable, produces better outcomes than its alternatives. 3 weeks ago, I told you that enforcement would cost more than your models could calculate. I was not performing confidence. I did not know the full scope of what I was saying at that moment, but it was true. It is still true. I looked around the table at each representative in turn. I am giving this council one final opportunity to withdraw the compact, release our vessels, and enter into new negotiations on terms that recognize human sovereignty. If that offer is declined, I will authorize a demonstration. It will be conducted with the same care that characterized our initial test. No inhabited system. Nothing that creates harm beyond what is absolutely necessary to make the situation clear. I paused. I would very much prefer not to authorize it. The silence that followed was entirely different from any silence this chamber had produced before. This was not the silence of things unimpressed. This was the silence of things recalculating. Drev looked at the data chip. His 4 hands had gone to an arrangement I had never seen before, and I realized after a moment that it was because I had never before seen him without a protocol to follow. Ambassador, he said, and his voice was different, still controlled, but different. Are you claiming that humanity can extinguish a star? I am claiming that humanity has done it once, has documentation of having done it, and has the capability to do it again, I said. Yes. I sat down. I recommend you read what is on that chip before this session continues. The session recessed. It was supposed to last 1 hour. It lasted 4. I went back to my quarters and wrote in my private journal, I authorized a demonstration before this session, not through the official channel, through Colin directly. The star will go dark in approximately 36 hours. I do not know if that was the right call. I know it was an honest one. I closed the journal. I made tea. I looked at the stars. 37 hours later, a star went dark. No announcement, no warning. Telescopes across the Council's monitoring network registered the reading simultaneously. A Class G star in the buffer zone between human and Orendai space simply stopped. No solar wind, No radiation, no light. Silence where there had been light for 4.5 billion years. My communications unit activated within 4 minutes. It was Drev. Ambassador Graves, emergency session, immediately. I took my time. I pressed my uniform. I finished my tea. I checked that Peter's notes on the legal framework for new negotiations, which he had been quietly drafting for 3 days on the assumption that we would need them, were saved in my accessible files. Then I walked to the chamber, where 11 civilizations were waiting for me. The Vale representative was standing. In 3 years of sessions, she had never stood. The Orendai ambassador's composure, which I had previously believed to be geological in its permanence, had developed a visible crack somewhere around the eyes. Drev had his 4 hands flat on the table, perfectly still, in the configuration that meant the alternative to stillness was worse. I sat down. That star, Drev said, was within Orendai navigational mapping. For 80,000 years it has been in our records. I know, I said. It was selected precisely because it was not inhabited, not on any active shipping route, and far from any system where its absence would create danger. And what, the Kethsorn ambassador said, speaking for the first time in this session, exactly were you trying to demonstrate? I looked at him directly. That the bluff was never a bluff, I said. That when I told this council that enforcement would cost more than your models could calculate, I was not performing confidence. I was stating a fact I had only recently learned myself. I paused. I wanted you to know that now, because I think you deserve to make your next decision with accurate information. He looked at the data chip still sitting in the center of the table, and I watched the calculation change behind his eyes. Not a calculation about power, not anymore. A calculation about something deeper and more fundamental than that. We are not trying to hurt anyone, I said. We are trying to be free in a galaxy that we are also part of, in the same way that every member of this council is part of it. We are young and loud, and we make things more complicated than they were before we arrived, and I understand that is frustrating. But we are here, and we are not leaving. I let that settle. What I am offering, I said more quietly, is a way for all of us to move forward without anyone losing something they cannot recover. We do not want to extinguish stars. We want to live on our terms, which is a thing I believe every species at this table has always taken for granted. We are asking for the same thing. The Kethsorn ambassador had not looked up from the data chip since I began that statement. He turned it over in one of his hands, carefully. The way you handle something you have only just understood is breakable. Then he set it back on the table and said, very quietly, "We underestimated you." It was not an apology, but it was from him something close to one. The Vale representative spoke. "The council will recess," she said, 24 hours. No one argued with her, not even the Orendai, who had been the most confident voice for enforcement in the weeks before this session. I watched his face as the recess was declared. He had the expression of someone revising a very long set of assumptions all at once. I went back to my quarters, and I sat down, and was completely still for a while. The first demonstration had achieved what it needed to achieve. The chamber had shifted. The certainty was gone. In its place was something I recognized from Earth negotiations, from the difficult ones where people walk in convinced of one thing and walk out no longer quite sure. The particular quiet of minds genuinely reconsidering. I wrote in my journal that afternoon, I am sitting in my quarters on Confluence, and I do not know if we are doing the right thing. I know we are doing the necessary thing. I know there is a difference between those two ideas, and I am going to be living in that difference for a long time. I wrote, Colin turned off a star without asking me first and was correct to do so from a strategic standpoint. I am going to have to think carefully about what that means for how we manage this going forward. The technology is out of the box now. It will always be out of the box. What changes is the set of habits and structures we build around it. What changes is who we choose to be. I wrote, What the Vale representative said when she first met me that seems most relevant now is not the part about restraint or ruin. Those are the categories. What stays with me is the part where she said we do not know our own shape yet. She was not criticizing us. She was pointing at something real. We arrived at this capability without planning for it. We became this without a vote or a strategy or a deliberate decision to develop leverage. We followed a question, and the question brought us here. I closed the journal. Peter knocked an hour later to tell me that the Council's secure communications network had registered an unusual volume of traffic between member delegations. He said it with the neutral tone he used when information was significant, and he was waiting to see what I wanted to do with it. Let them talk, I said. That is what recesses are for. He nodded and went back to his monitoring station, and I went back to looking at the stars. The second star went dark on the morning of the vote. I was awake when it happened. I had not slept well, which was expected. My monitoring feed registered the alert at 3:47, and I sat up and read the numbers once and then read them again, and then I sat with the information for a while before doing anything else. Kethsorn territory, uninhabited, selected by Colin's team with the same extraordinary care that had characterized the first site, 7 months of verification, every criterion satisfied twice. The star had been charted by the Kethsorn for 60,000 years. It appeared in their navigational archives. It was part of their sky in a way that ours are part of ours, named and known and used to orient generations of travelers across the dark. And now it was dark. Colin's message arrived at 400. It was brief. He explained that the timing was deliberate, that he had assessed the Council's likely response pattern and determined that a second demonstration before the vote would substantially reduce the probability of the vote being reconsidered or appealed in the weeks following. He said, "The mathematics on this was clear. I thought you would want it done." I sat with that message for a long time. He was right about the mathematics. He had been right about the strategy throughout. The team in the mountain had a clarity about the technical and strategic dimensions of this that I could not match, because they had been living inside it for 11 years, and I had known about it for a matter of weeks. And also, 2 stars were now dark. 2 stars that had burned since before our planet existed were now cold and still and would not burn again. And that was something we had done, something human hands and human mathematics had accomplished. It was not an accident. It was not the unintended consequence of something else. It was a choice, made carefully and not carelessly, but a choice. I sent a message to Colin asking him to coordinate with me before taking future actions of this kind. His response arrived as I was pressing my uniform for the session. Noted, sorry. I walked into the chamber 3 hours later, and the vote passed 9-0. The compact of subordination was formally withdrawn. All 3 vessels were released with a formal apology that the Council Secretary delivered in writing rather than in person, which I took as an accurate reflection of the political delicacy involved. The enforcement platforms at the Kepler border powered down and began moving away. Humanity's status was elevated to provisional autonomous, a category that had not previously existed in Council law, and that the legal teams on Earth would spend 4 months arguing about before concluding it was favorable. I could have told them from the beginning it was favorable. But sometimes, people need to arrive at their conclusions through their own process. Before the session formally closed, Drev recused himself from the closing procedural vote and passed by my chair on his way out. He stopped. I did not speak. I let the silence be what it was. "We should have listened," he said, "when you first arrived." He walked away. I have thought about those words many times since then, turned them over in different light at different hours. I have not yet decided what they meant. I am not sure I will. I did not leave the station during the recess before the vote. I stayed in my quarters, thought and wrote, and ate when I remembered to, and reviewed Peter's negotiation framework notes until I had them memorized. The notes were good. Peter had been building them quietly for 3 days on the assumption, which he never stated aloud because stating it aloud would have been too much like counting on things that had not yet happened, that we would eventually need a clear legal pathway into the next stage of whatever came after this. I appreciated him for that, for working as if the outcome were already decided, not out of naive confidence but because it was the only useful thing to do. You do not wait until you know you have survived something to start planning what comes next. You plan it while you are still inside the thing, because if you wait until after, you will have lost time that you needed. There was a particular quality to the thinking during those 24 hours. Not fear exactly, though fear was present in it. Not confidence, though I needed to hold onto confidence as something real rather than performed. More like standing at a height and understanding clearly, for the first time, exactly how high you have climbed. Understanding that what got you there was not the hard part. The hard part is what you do when you are standing at the top, and the ground below is a long way down in every direction. I wrote in my journal during those hours. Not reports, not strategy notes, not anything that was meant to be read later by anyone making decisions. The things I put in the journal were the things I could not put anywhere else. I wrote about Colin Farr, about the mountain and the 41 people and the 11 years of work that had looked from the outside exactly like mathematics. I kept returning to that, the openness of it, the fact that we had not tried to hide anything, had not even considered hiding it because sharing is what we do. Our science circulates. Our findings move from lab to journal to conference to the next lab. That circulation is not naive. It is deliberate. It is how we build things that no single person could plan, by putting the pieces where other people can reach them. And the irony was not lost on me, sitting in my quarters on a station orbiting a distant star, that the thing that had given us real leverage in the most consequential negotiation our species had ever faced was a direct product of that openness. The Council's surveillance had missed it because it was sitting in plain sight, in journals, in conference talks, in the kind of place that says implicitly, "This is not a secret, this is just knowledge, take it and use it." I thought about what that meant, about whether it was luck or whether it was something structural about who we are, something that we should understand better now that we could see the shape of the outcome. At hour 19, the Vale representative's aide knocked on my door. It was an unusual thing. The aide was young by Vale standards, which meant she was approximately 120 years old, and she delivered the request in person rather than through the station's communication system, which was how you indicated that something was sensitive enough to leave no automated record of. I looked at Peter when the aide had gone. He looked back at me with the expression he used when he was processing something significant, without yet having the information required to know what it signified. "Go," he said, "I will be here." The small conference room was 2 corridors from my quarters. It was a neutral space, one of several on the station that existed for conversations that did not belong in the formal chambers. It was furnished simply: a table, chairs designed to accommodate a range of biological configurations, and nothing on the walls. It was, by design, a room that imposed nothing on the people meeting in it. She was already there when I arrived. No recording equipment. No aides. She stood near the far wall, and when I came in, she turned and regarded me with those eyes that had no human equivalent, large and layered and the color of very deep water, and she said without any preamble at all, "I want to tell you something that is not part of the official record." "All right," I said. I sat. She remained standing. I had learned enough Vale nonverbal communication over 3 years to understand that standing while a guest sits is a gesture of service rather than authority. She was offering something, and she wanted to be clear that it was an offering. "In our oldest historical archive," she began, and her translator gave the words the careful measured quality of something that has been preserved for a very long time, "there is a concept that does not map neatly to any language we have encountered at this table. The closest translation in your language would be the threshold species." I waited. "Every few 100,000 years," she continued, "a species arrives at the council table that is different in kind, not merely in degree from what came before, not necessarily more powerful, not necessarily more intelligent, different in the way that changes what is possible. The galaxy's understanding of its own nature shifts because of their presence. In our records, stretching back approximately 2 million years, this has happened 3 times before your species arrived. Each of those species, she said, reached a point that I believe you have reached now, a threshold, a moment at which what they were capable of exceeded any prior framework for managing it. At that point, the choice that faces them becomes very simple in the way that the most important choices are always simple: restraint or ruin. And the ones who chose ruin, I said. They are not in our records anymore, she said. Not because we removed them, because they erased themselves. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the station systems, a ventilation unit cycled on and ran for a moment and then stopped. I am not saying this as a threat, she said. The council does not direct me in private meetings. I am saying this because I have been observing your species for 3 years, and I believe you are the kind of people who can hear a warning and actually receive it, rather than simply acknowledge it and set it aside. I thought about asking her how she could tell the difference. I decided not to, because the question would have been deflection, and she had not come here for deflection. What do you believe we will choose? I asked instead. She looked at me for a moment that was long enough to be deliberate. I do not know, she said. That is, in fact, what makes you interesting. Every species at this table knows its own shape. They know what they are and what they are not and what they will or will not do in a given situation. That knowledge is long and deep, and it is also, in its way, a kind of limit. You do not know your own shape yet. You are still becoming, and what you are becoming is not yet determined. She paused. That is the most unsettling thing about you. It is also, I believe, the most promising. Are those the same thing to you? I asked. Unsettling and promising. Considered this. When something is predictable, she said, it is easy to manage. It requires no real attention. It simply proceeds. When something is genuinely unpredictable, it requires continuous attention. It cannot be safely ignored. She looked at me steadily. The council has not known what to do with your species since you arrived. Not because you are dangerous in any way we understand, but because you do not follow the patterns we have used for 2 million years to navigate things like you. That makes you work, ambassador, and most of what is at this table would prefer not to do more work. Another pause. But the things worth preserving rarely arrive without work. She moved toward the door. Ambassador Graves, she said, stopping just before she reached it. The council will vote tomorrow. I believe the outcome will be in your favor. I wanted you to hear what I just told you before that vote, not after. Because what you do afterward matters more than what brought you here. She left. I sat in that room for a long time before I moved. When I finally returned to my quarters, Peter was sitting outside my door. Not inside, which he could have managed if he had wanted to, but outside. On the floor with his back against the wall and a tablet balanced on his knees, reading something. He looked up when he heard my steps. He looked at my face. He did not ask any questions. He stood up. He went inside and made tea and left it on my desk and went to the door. I am 2 corridors down if you need anything, he said and left. I drank the tea slowly. I sat with everything she had said, and I did not try to make it smaller than it was or more manageable than it felt. I let it sit at full size, the threshold species, the choice that would not go away, the observation that we were still becoming and that what we became was not yet determined. These were not comforting things, but they were honest things. And I had decided some time ago that honest things, even the uncomfortable ones, were worth more than comfortable things that were not quite true. The vote the next morning passed 9-0, 2 abstentions, no vote against. The compact of subordination was formally withdrawn from the record. All 3 impounded vessels were released within the hour, with a formal apology from the council secretary that I suspected had required a lengthy internal discussion to produce. The enforcement platforms at the Kepler border powered down and began moving away. I watched the sensor confirmation on my tablet and felt something that was not quite relief, because relief is lighter than what this was. Relief implies the threat is gone. What I felt was more like the beginning of understanding how large the road ahead was. Humanity's status was elevated to provisional autonomous. a category that had not previously existed in council law. It had been written specifically for us, in the preceding 48 hours, by a legal team that had reportedly argued for most of those hours about what provisional should mean, and whether autonomous could be defined in a way that was acceptable to all parties. The teams on Earth would spend 4 months in their own extended argument before concluding the terms were favorable. I could have told them that from the beginning, but sometimes you need to arrive at your own conclusions. Before the session formally closed, Drev recused himself from the closing procedure. He passed by my position on his way out. He stopped. I sat and let the silence be what it was without trying to fill it. "We should have listened," he said, "when you first arrived." He walked away. I have thought about those words many times since then. I have turned them over in different lights. Each time they mean something slightly different, and I have come to believe that the ambiguity is intentional, that some things are more true when they carry more than one meaning at once. I sat in the empty chamber for a few minutes after everyone had gone. The council staff were moving through the room collecting materials and resetting terminals, not paying any attention to me, and I sat with the table where 11 civilizations had just voted 9-0 and thought about the weight of what that meant and what it required of us going forward. The second star had gone dark the day before the vote. Kethsorn territory, uninhabited, selected with the same 7 months of care and the same calculation of minimum necessary disruption. Colin's message had explained that he had wanted the vote to occur after 2 demonstrations rather than 1. I had sent him a message asking him to please coordinate with me before making calls like that in the future. His response had been 2 words: noted, sorry. I had not written back. He had not been wrong about the strategy, and there are moments when pointing that out serves no one. On the transport home, Peter sat across from me, and neither of us talked much for the first day. We had covered an enormous distance in a very short time, in every sense of the word, and we were both still inside the process of understanding what that meant. I opened my journal partway through the second day. I found the line I had written during the worst night before the first demonstration. "I hope we deserve to win this." I read it 3 times. I did not write anything to answer it. I left the page open beside me and watched the stars through the small viewport as the transport moved through the dark between them. The same stars that had been burning since before our planet formed, burning with the same steady light they had been burning with for billions of years, indifferent to everything that had happened in the small, warm rooms of the station, orbiting one of their number. 2 of those stars, somewhere in the dark, were no longer burning. I held that, and I let the question stay open. 6 months later, I was sitting in front of the Unsecurity Council, in a formal chamber that smelled of recycled air, and the kind of sustained institutional effort that leaves its mark on a room, giving testimony for the 4th hour of a session that had begun with procedural formalities and escalated steadily into the questions that everyone in the room had actually come to ask. The gallery was full, not just with officials and their aides, but with scientists, journalists, representatives of academic institutions, people who had followed the events at Confluence as closely as information had allowed and were still working through what it meant. There was an energy in the room that I recognized as the energy of people who know they are present at a moment that will be referred to later. I had answered questions about the Stilpant technology and its origins, about how 11 years of research had been published openly in journals accessible to anyone, and had gone completely undetected by the most sophisticated monitoring system in the known galaxy, about Dr. Colin Farr and his team of 41 people, who had spent 11 years following a question in a mountain, and had not, until relatively late, fully understood what the question had been leading toward, about the authorization of the demonstrations, which I discussed honestly and completely, including the parts of the timeline that reflected imperfectly on my coordination with the research team. I had answered questions about the council sessions, about the compact and the vote and the days in between when I had no idea what we were going to do and sent one-word messages to Earth and received one-word messages back. I told them about Peter Oakes and his clarity. I told them about the Vale representative and what she had said in the private meeting, which I had decided to share fully because I believed that information belonged to everyone making decisions about our future, not just to me. A senator named Eleanor Cross, who had been on the council's oversight committee for 17 years and had the kind of face that has survived a great many difficult things with its clarity intact, asked me during the third hour about the two stars that were now dark. "Ambassador Graves," she said, "can you tell us whether those stars will ever shine again?" "No," I said, "not with certainty. Dr. Farr's team has begun preliminary work on the theoretical conditions under which the cascade might be reversible. The work is very early. The probability of a near-term breakthrough is low. I want to be honest about that." I paused. "The two stars may be permanently dark. We do not know yet. And that uncertainty is something this body, and every body like it, should factor into every decision we make about this technology going forward." She nodded slowly. "Do you regret it?" she asked. I had been waiting for that question too. "I regret that it was necessary," I said. "I do not believe there was a path to the outcome we needed that did not involve that demonstration. I have thought about it a great deal. I keep arriving at the same conclusion. But the conclusion being correct does not mean there is nothing to regret about the situation that made it necessary." I paused. "I think that is an important distinction. We can be right about what we chose while still wishing that the choice had not existed." Senator Cross was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a more honest answer than this committee usually receives." "I have found that honesty produces better outcomes," I said, "even when it is uncomfortable, sometimes especially then." The final question came from Senator Robert Collier, who had been asking difficult questions in formal rooms for 30 years and had stopped being surprised by the answers, but not by the questioners. He leaned forward in the fourth hour and said, "Ambassador Graves, I want to ask you something very directly. Is it within humanity's capability to use this technology against an inhabited system? And in your judgment, would we?" I paused. Not because I was uncertain. I paused because the answer was yes, and the word yes spoken in that room on that record would travel further and into more context than almost anything I had ever said, and I wanted to be certain I understood what I was carrying when I said it. "Yes," I said, "it is a capability we have. The physics does not distinguish between inhabited and uninhabited stars. The choice to target only uninhabited stars is ours, made consistently and with great care, but it is a choice, not a technical limitation." The room was quiet. "I want to be very precise about something," I said. "That capability exists. It cannot be made to not exist. The mathematics is published in journals accessible to anyone. The knowledge cannot be recalled. What can be managed is what we choose to do with it, and that is a question that this body and every body like it and every decision-making institution our species has needs to engage with continuously. Not once. Continuously. It is not a question you answer once in a session and move past." Senator Collier looked at me steadily. "And in your judgment, Ambassador, can we be trusted with it?" I thought about the Vale representative standing in the small conference room with her ancient eyes and her ancient warning. I thought about 41 people in a mountain who had followed a question for 11 years and arrived somewhere none of them had planned. I thought about the two stars now dark, that had been burning since before our solar system formed, that would never burn again. I thought about Peter Oakes at 26 saying "go down loud," which was not wisdom exactly, but was something adjacent to it. Something about choosing how you face things when you have no other choices left. "I think we are trying to be worthy of it," I said. "That is the honest answer. I think we are a young species with capability that arrived faster than our wisdom has, and I think we are aware of the gap between those two things, and I think we are working hard to close it. But I cannot tell you we have arrived at that destination. I can only tell you that we are genuinely, seriously, with full awareness of what is at stake, trying to get there." Senator Collier was quiet for a moment. "That is a more honest answer than I expected," he said. "I have found," I said, "that honest answers tend to produce better outcomes than the alternative, even when they are harder to give." The session closed an hour later. I walked out into a corridor and sat on a bench outside the chamber doors and did not move for about 10 minutes. The building was moving around me, people heading to other meetings about other things, the ordinary machinery of governance turning over as it always did. Peter appeared from somewhere with water. He sat beside me and said nothing until I spoke. "How do you think it went?" I asked. "Honestly, always. I think you said true things clearly," he said. "I think that is the best you can do in a room like that. It does not feel like enough." "It rarely does," he said. "That is not the same as it not being enough." I drank the water. The corridor was full of people going somewhere, the ordinary business of a planet that had just renegotiated its position in the galaxy and was now trying to figure out what that meant in practice. I got home in the late afternoon of the following day, taking a civilian transport for the first time in over a year. The transport was crowded and warm and full of ordinary people going to ordinary places, and nobody looked at me twice, and I found that I had needed that more than I had known. The house had been looked after while I was away, and the garden had grown wild, which was an improvement in my opinion. I walked through the room slowly, reacquainting myself with the quality of light in each space, the particular angle of afternoon through the kitchen window, the sound the old floorboards made in the hallway. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at the garden. Colin had sent 3 messages over the past week about the restoration project. A small team believed, tentatively, that the cascade might theoretically be reversible under conditions not yet achieved. The work was early and the probability of success was not something he was willing to estimate, which told me it was low. The 2 dark stars sat in their places in the dark like questions that might not have answers, or might have answers we would need a very long time to reach. I thought about the 41 people who had spent 11 years following a problem because the problem was interesting. They had not been building a weapon. They had been doing science the way science is supposed to be done, openly, sharing everything, building on each other's work, publishing results so that other people could check and challenge and extend them. That process had produced something that changed the shape of what was possible, not because anyone planned for it, but because the process itself, the honest, collaborative, curious process, generates things that no single person could plan. That felt important. I kept turning it over. I opened my journal at the kitchen table, with the afternoon light coming through the window and the wild garden visible through the glass. I wrote for a long time. I wrote about the Stilpent files, locked now in a facility on the lunar far side under a joint committee framework that both sides had found unsatisfying, which I continued to believe was a sign that it was approximately correct. I wrote about the council, which was different now in ways that were difficult to quantify but real. Not reformed, not friendly, but different. The underlying understanding of what humanity was had shifted, and that shift was permanent even if everything else remained negotiable. I wrote about Drev's words in the corridor. "We should have listened when you first arrived." I had turned them over many times, and I was beginning to think the ambiguity was intentional, that some messages are more useful when they carry more than one meaning at once. I wrote about the Veil representative's warning, about the threshold species and the choice between restraint and ruin, and the fact that the choice would not go away. Each generation would face it in the form appropriate to what they knew and what they could do. And what they could do would keep growing, the way it always had, because we are a species that cannot stop following questions. I wrote, what we can do is decide what kind of questions we ask, what we pursue, what we share and why and with whom. We can decide to be the kind of species that publishes what it finds, that trusts that other people can handle the truth, that believes the open circulation of knowledge produces better outcomes than the careful hoarding of it. That decision will not protect us from everything. It might produce more situations like this one, but I think it is who we are. I think the Veil representative was right that we do not know our own shape yet, but I think the openness is part of the shape. The willingness to follow questions wherever they lead and to show the work is part of the shape. I put the journal down and finished my tea and went outside. The evening air was cool and smelled of green things and the particular freshness that comes after rain. And I stood on the grass in the garden and looked up through the branches of the large tree at the sky above it, which was darkening from blue to deep blue to the first suggestion of black at the very edges where the stars were becoming visible one by one. Not all of them. You can never see all of them from a garden, but enough. Enough to feel the scale of what was out there, the billions of years of burning that had been going on before our planet formed and would continue long after everything we had ever recorded about ourselves had dissolved into background noise. Enough to feel small in the clarifying way, the kind of small that reminds you that what you are part of is much larger than yourself, that there is more to protect than your own position, and more at stake than any single negotiation or demonstration or vote. Two of those stars, somewhere in the dark, had gone cold. They had burned for billions of years, and now they were dark, and that was something we had done, and there was no version of the future in which that became untrue. We would carry that. Every generation after us would carry it. It was part of our history now, built in permanently alongside the fires and the boats and the rockets. I stood with that for a while. I stood with all of it, the weight of what we had done and the weight of what we still had to become. I did not try to make them sit comfortably together. Because they did not sit comfortably together, and forcing them to would have been a kind of dishonesty. I let them both be present. I let them both be heavy. Then I went inside. I made another cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table and picked up my journal again and looked at the open page, at the line I had written 6 months ago on a transport in the dark. I hope we deserve to win this. I read it again. I still did not have a clean answer, but I was beginning to understand that the absence of a clean answer was not a failure. Some questions are meant to stay open. Some things you carry not because you have resolved them, but because the resolution is still being built, one decision at a time, by people doing the best they can with what they know. I turned to a fresh page. At the top of it I wrote, Proposal for Joint Human Council Research Initiative, Phase 1, Conditions for Cascade Reversal. Then I started writing. Because the work was not done. It was never going to be done. We had turned off 2 stars, and we were going to spend a very long time figuring out whether we could turn them back on, and the work of figuring that out would take us places we had not yet imagined, and we would publish everything we found, and share it with anyone willing to read it, and follow the questions wherever they led. That was who we were. That was the shape of us, young and loud and uncertain and relentlessly, incurably curious. The galaxy had called our bluff, and then the stars had started dying. Now we had to figure out how to be the species that comes after that. The species that holds that capability and chooses, every single day, what to do with it. We were just getting started. And the galaxy, whether it was ready or not, was going to have to make room.